so big. Look at it compared to my head. It's amazing typesetting, but it's like it's like having a newspaper.
Well, it's like the thing you'd read if you're trying to be inconspicuous in a cafe.
Yeah, put the eye hole through it.
And that's like the title of a Prynne parody, isn't it? Sketch for a theory of how many secondary texts would render JH Prynne scrutable.
Yeah. I suppose it's like, for me, it's like when I come to those poems, like what kind of scrutability am I trying to make? Because it feels like it is me imposing it. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to want to put on something that you're reading, though. I think that's quite a normal thing, you know. Sketch for a financial theory of the self. The qualities, as they continue, are the silk under the hand. Because their celestial progress across the sky is so hopeless and so to be hoped for, I hope for silk, always. And the strands are not pure, though the name is so. The name is the sidereal display. It is what we know we cannot now have. The last light is the name it carries. It is this binds us to our unbroken trust.
So then we should not trust the hope that is merely a name for silk, for purity untouched by any Italian hand. The celestial routine is begging, and a nasty toy at that. The stars are names, and the names are necessarily false. We choose to believe in the flotsam, the light glance passing, and innocent because unpriced.
Which is grossly untrue, because we pay for it well enough. I have squandered so much life and good nature I could hardly guess the account. The numbers are out there in the human sky, the pure margin, which are the trust we deserve. And we should have what the city does need, the sky, if we did not so want the need.
The name of that is, of course, money, and the absurd trust in value is the pattern of bonds and contract and interest, just where the names are exactly equivalent to the trust given to them. Here then is the purity of pragmatic function. We give the name of ourselves to our needs. We want what we are.
And not silk, except for ties, or the sky is even for exchange. The coin of the face we look up to has a vault ready for trust. That much is trickery. But the names, do you not see, are just the tricks we trust, which we choose. The qualities, then, are a name, corporately, for the hope that they will return to us. The virtue in whose exercise we retain the fiction of air, silence, fluid round the hub of the weak.
How could this be clearer? The items are that we are bribed and that silk is a random, but by tradition, a costly gift. Quality is habit.
What follows is where we are now. What follows is where we are now, or where I am. The old cry about chastity, that we are bound by the parts of our unnatural frames. The median condition is the city, and not the travel or the remoteness of travel in sound. Music, travel, habit, and silence are all money. Purity is a glissade into the last, most beautiful return.
And how much we hope, for it is the primacy of count. This is the shining grudge of numbers, the name we will not lose to any possible stranger, the star and silk of my eye that will not return.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. There's a few things that are jumping out at me. Like one is like the literal thread in the poem, like the silk.
Yeah.
And I guess there seems to be like this really surface reading of it, which is about like the kind of movement of commodities and I guess the abstraction of value into money, into metal. There's an essay later on the book called A Note on Metal, which goes into this about like the earliest developments of value into the substance of literal money. So that seems to be one thing. The theory of the self feels like it's kind of like the self in accordance to these rules, which are like kind of insisted upon as like unnatural circumstances for humans to be within. So it kind of goes back and forth between this bigger kind of narrative, which is quite an intimate description of the poetics of value, and then the composed self, I guess.
You said silk there. Like, what is it specifically of silk that is? Why is it silk as a material and not another? Partly because I guess, well, for this time we're still in like the late 60s. It's still Marxism, right? Like, it's still like Marx uses £10 of silk as equivalent value, 16 quarter weights of lead or whatever the lines are.
And it's the thing that in chapter 1 of Capital, the thing about the commodity actually containing the value and substance. Well, I can't remember the wording, but like containing the lives of the people who produce it. Like, it's that really famous bit about the jacket, and the workers' lives are actually stitched in, and it's like they're literally there. It's not figurative. The way that Marx puts it is that those lives are actually subsumed into the commodity.
Yeah, see, that's always a really interesting thing for me, because I read particularly Capital as being like a very like dry sociological text. I haven't read it per se with a poetic view. So those kind of things are more figurative they are more metaphorical than they are literal for me. I find it more like an exegesis on industry. So when we say that people's bodies are literally sewn into the jacket, it's something that I don't have much of a perspective on, I guess. But silk as well, so that is merely a name for silk, for purity untouched by any Italian hand. Like, that's a very particular a time and place and economy that he's touching on there, right? And that there's I guess medieval times is when like silk is the seamstresses, probably seamstresses in Italy, and their ability to work silk. That's a particular historical moment that he's alluding to, right? It's a kind of a very rarefied skill. It's not merely silk as a material, as a quality. It's a historically located silk, and I'm wondering what the silk is later.
Yeah, what it turns into. I mean, I actually just want to put the brakes on a bit and just think about the first line, actually. Like, so the qualities, first of all, it's not quality, it's qualities. Qualities are plural as they continue. So the plural qualities are continuing. The qualities as they continue are the silk. So the qualities, plural, in continuous motion, are the single thing, the silk, under the hand. So like all of these, I get all of these threads that are like continuing, like it feels like a forward motion, continue, are sort of one thing under one hand, and one really specifically named thing, silk. I wish I knew more about the history of silk.
Yeah, I don't.
And different uses for the word silk as well, actually. I wonder, is there perhaps a fine, strong, soft, lustrous fibre produced by silkworms in making cocoons and collected to make thread or fabric, or a queen's or king's council?
I mean, it's my understanding of the history, like a lot of the history of the kind of the sociological transition between feudalism and where we are now, taking in various versions of capital. Silk is the connection between us and China. Like, that's the Silk Road. Like,
Yeah.
the idea of international trade is predicated on things like herbs, spices, and silk.
So looking at an online etymology dictionary, words in Middle English from Old English, the immediate source is uncertain. It probably reached English via the Baltic trade routes. Cognates in Old Norse, silky, Danish silke, and Swedish silk was an E, Russian schalk, all ultimately from late Latin, from ancient Greek, and says ultimately from an Oriental language, represented now by a Chinese figure. So yeah, that would make sense. So maybe like its route through history is very similar to the Silk Road now, as is. The commodity moves, the language moves in the same.
I mean, it's particularly commodious, if I can use that word, insofar as something like the movement of steel, or like say modern day materials which are mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo for our phones, right? Like there's a very clear utility value, a clear sort of technological value to certain materials, and silk is primarily clothing, but it's also primarily clothing which communicates prestige. And I don't want to say that fashion isn't a commodity, because it very much is, right? And I don't want to say that it has no utility, but it's a particularly feminized and a particularly
feminized in its current moment, at least.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And that differs in different cultures too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I mean,
but it's like a kind of high commodity in a sense, like well, I don't know, like I suppose like gold paints or something like that. It's like your lovely beret. Well, that's I mean, maybe not quite, because that's kind of military as well.
Yeah, true.
But it's something to display wealth. So quality in terms of not just the qualities that are put into the commodity, but like it's like a measure of quality, of some kind of quality of life or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just to say, like at its present moment, it's feminized. I'm wondering. My feeling is that for the Marxism, for Marxist capital, and I think for 1960s United Kingdom, I suspect it probably was feminized then as well. For the context from which Prynne may have been writing. In terms of interpreting this poem, I feel like silk is potentially more feminine as a commodity than a hammer, for instance.
Yeah. What do we take the line, that fourth line in? I hope for silk always, and the strands are not pure, though the name is so. I wonder who this I is that hopes for silk, and what it means to hope for silk, and what it means that the strands are not pure, though the name is so. The strands, that seems like, again, we can put like quite an obvious like Marxist reading onto that, like, the strands are not pure. For me, like, that sort of speaks of the violence of the value abstraction or whatever, and their journey. But the name is pure. I wonder what sort of purity that is, and what sort of I that is. Those are my two questions. Those seem to be the pivots of these lines for me. I and pure. Yeah. I guess coming back to the marks as well, like it's this bit, isn't it? If we leave aside the determinate quality of productive activity and therefore the useful character of the labour, what remains is the quality of being an expenditure of human labour power, tailoring and weaving, although they are qualitatively different productive activities, are both a productive expenditure of human brains, muscles, nerves, hands, etc. And in this sense, both human labour, they are merely two different forms of the expenditure of human labour power. And then, what
So I
is
mean,
the theory of the self? What's the thesis at the end?
it has. I was thinking when you were saying about numbering a second ago about things like Spinoza's Ethics and Wittgenstein's Tractatus.
Okay, I don't know anything about either of those things, so you might have to. Yeah, tell me about
I don't think it's important to know, except to say that they make their points by numbering. Like there's a series of iterative ideas at which arrives at whatever their fundamental thesis is. Actually, quite diverse thesis, but it's a relatively common thing in amongst things like metaphysics and ethics to order your thoughts in that way by numbering them to illustrate precisely a progression of thought and how given 1 and 2 therefore 3 it's quite a common thing. It's almost a trite thing to say, really. Within the narrative of this, if you take number 1 as here's a couple of propositions, and then 2 is a consequence, but then 3 is it's subverting that. Like whatever has come from 1 and 2, he starts number 3 with saying, which is grossly untrue because we pay for it well enough.
yeah.
Which is coming back to what you were saying about like who is the self here, or what is existing in the gaps of this self, which is generated or articulated by Marx, Marx and Engels, maybe, who knows. I have squandered so much life and good nature I could hardly guess the account.
Yeah.
Is this kind of is it against Marxism, or is it a humanizing Marxism, or is it trying to problematize Marxism, or
Yeah.
the numbers?
I wonder, like, so that line, squandering, seems to be like the word that's operating that clause. So much life. It's like it doesn't necessarily. We can sort of naturalize it and think that means the life of the subject in the poem or the poet or whatever, but actually it doesn't say that. It just says life. And to squander life within this analysis, if we're thinking about that kind of idea of like labor value being like actually accumulated into commodities or whatever, then squandering it's sort of like, well, against this theory of quality, where and what the confusion of like quality, the sort of abstract nature of quality and value against each other in this analysis. Well, it's very easy to squander. Like it's in fact it's probably impossible not to squander the lives of others. But I think it's also turning into the self in maybe humanized is right. Like in number 7, what follows is where we are now, or where I am. Where we are now, or where I am. So it's one or the other. But it doesn't feel like that's a dividing line. Actually, it's again, that feels speculative. What follows is where we are now, or where I am. Either or, possibly both, or one or the other. I'm not sure which it's doing. For me, it's either or, maybe.
I mean, there's a line break there which suggests a more heavy emphasis on I am than you would have in spoken language. Because if you just read this without that line break, what follows is where we are now, or where I am, or where I am. But having that really heavy line under I am, I guess it's quite odd, given, like you say, he avoids using I much further on. So what is it about? I mean, is it specific to the subject of self that inclines him to use I more within this, or is it merely just bringing it back to speculation? What follows is where we are now, or where I am. It's one of those things you'd say, like, that's what I think. Maybe your mileage varies.
Yeah. I think there's something about perhaps leaving that question open at this point to put pressure on what comes next. The old cry about chastity. The old cry about chastity. I mean, I'm thinking about very Protestant chastity here for some reason, mainly because of the sort of placement in time and the Protestant work ethic, and how this seems to be so wrapped up in that. That we are bound by the parts of our unnatural frames. And then the median condition is the city, and not the travel or the remoteness of travel in sound. Music, travel, habits, and silence are all money. Like, absolutely. And the money italicized in this. Purity, glissade. I need to look up that word. I may have pronounced it wrong. Glissade.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I'm afraid.
It is the act of descending a steep snow or scree-covered slope via a controlled slide on one's feet or buttocks.
Oh,
It's also a ballet term. So it can mean climbing, in climbing, a way to descend a snow-covered slope. So I think like something that might be to break a fall or something, or to stop you just falling down.
specifically a motion of descent.
Yeah. In ballet, a travelling step starting in fifth position from demi-plie, leading foot brushes out to dégagé, as weight bears on the trailing leg. Weight is shifted to the leading leg via a jump, and the trailing foot extends out of plie into dégagé. The leading foot lands tombé, and the trailing foot slides to meet the leading foot in fifth position. The glissade can be done on avant, leading front to back hands and back, leading back to front hands to front, or without changement of feet. Wow.
Did you ever do ballet?
A friend taught me some of the. She taught me all the positions once,
Right.
and I've watched a fair bit of ballet. I do enjoy it, but I mean, it's extremely complicated.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I've always enjoyed watching it whenever I've had the opportunity, but wish I saw more. Really, I might watch some ballet later.
Habit and silence are all money. Purity is a glissade into the last most beautiful return. Out of those contexts, the glissade sounds the most like it's within the context of the ballet here. The most beautiful return, like returning to a position.
I mean, what
Purity and chastity in this.
I was wondering if glissade in that context, if we take it as the kind of scooching down on your ass down a hill, like this quite inelegant way of kind of slowing. Purity is a glissade into the last most beautiful return. Potentially the one reading which is sliding on your ass, and the other reading which is the elegance and beauty of ballet, suddenly make glissade potentially into a provocation. Like, is the glissade actually an elegant entry into this most beautiful return? Is purity actually an inelegant return? Is this kind of a negation of the alleged beauty of purity within the context of self? Because music, travel, habit, and silence are all money. Like, my inclination is that is to undermine those things, not to valorize money, to use a mixed metaphor, I guess.
Do you think maybe the callback to chastity and purity then is kind of like, it's no good to go back to the state before the abstraction that we're talking about now either? Like, the sort of, I guess the old cry for chastity, it's like a false promise.
Yeah.
It's not good enough. Like, it's I don't know.
This is that's a kind of politically, that's really imperative for me, is that we don't, like anarcho-primitivists, and a lot of I guess green fascism. Like, there's a lot of this idea of like Avalon or something, like this previous state of purity, and it is bullshit, and we cannot return to it. And problematic though 5G is, it's not fucking giving me COVID. It's not giving me vaccinations or whatever shit it is. Like that's a real red flag for me. That kind of idea of a previous time which was pure.